September 14th, 1812. Moscow. The French army is at the gates. Napoleon Bonaparte himself will enter the city within hours, and Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the governor of Moscow, is doing something that seems absolutely insane. He's setting the city on fire. Not accidentally, not in panic, deliberately, systematically. He's ordered his men to ignite the warehouses, the merchant quarters, the wooden neighborhoods. Moscow, one of the greatest cities in Europe, the ancient capital of Russia, is about to become an inferno. And he's doing it on purpose. By the time Napoleon enters Moscow expecting a triumph, he'll find a city in flames. Within 3 days, 3/4 of Moscow will be ash. The French will occupy ruins. There will be no food, no shelter, no supplies for winter, just smoke and rubble. This wasn't some accident of war. This was a calculated decision by Russian authorities. Burn our own capital, deny it to the enemy, make victory worthless. And here's the truly remarkable part. It worked. This is the story of how Russia defeated Napoleon, not by being stronger, but by being willing to lose everything. How Russian generals were accused of treason for retreating. How the decision to burn Moscow was so controversial that people are still debating who actually gave the order. How an entire nation chose self-destruction over surrender. You've probably heard that Napoleon lost in Russia because of winter and bad planning. That's true, but incomplete. The real story is what the Russians did. The choices they made, the prices they paid. Because defeating Napoleon required Russia to do something almost unprecedented, deliberately devastate their own country. In this video, you'll discover why Russian generals were nearly executed for the strategy that saved the nation. How the decision to retreat was so unpopular that it almost caused a military coup. What it was like for ordinary Russians to watch their government burn their cities. How the burning of Moscow was covered up and mythologized, and how Russia turned the worst year in their history into their greatest national story. To understand why Russia made these terrible choices, we need to understand the impossible situation they were facing in 1812. Let's go back to the moment when war became inevitable. By 1810, Russia was in a dangerous position. Napoleon controlled most of Europe. He'd beaten Austria, Prussia, and Russia itself in previous wars. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 had forced Russia into an alliance with France. Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon had even met on a raft in the middle of a river and agreed to be partners. But it was a partnership nobody in Russia wanted. The main issue was the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain. Russia had agreed to stop trading with the British, but the Russian economy depended on that trade. Russian landowners exported grain, timber, and other goods to Britain. British manufactured goods were essential for Russian consumers. Cutting off that trade was strangling the Russian economy. By 1810, Alexander was quietly ignoring the blockade. Russian ports were full of British ships using neutral flags. Napoleon knew it, and from his perspective, if he let Russia break the blockade, the entire continental system would collapse. So Napoleon began assembling an army, the largest army Europe had ever seen, 600,000 men. The message was clear: comply with the blockade or face invasion. Alexander had a choice: submit to Napoleon's demands and destroy the Russian economy, or go to war against an enemy who'd never lost a major campaign. Russia chose war. But they had a problem. The Russian army had about 200,000 troops available in the western part of the country. Napoleon had 600,000, 3-to-1 advantage, and Napoleon was arguably the greatest tactical commander in history. If Russia fought Napoleon the traditional way, defending their border, protecting their cities, engaging in open battle, they would lose. Badly. Quickly. So Russian military leadership faced the most important strategic question in their history. How do you beat an unbeatable enemy? The answer they came up with would define the entire campaign, and it was deeply controversial from the very beginning. The strategy had a name: scorched earth. Retreat before the French advance. Don't defend cities, abandon them. Don't protect supplies, destroy them. Burn crops, burn villages, burn anything the French could use. Draw Napoleon deeper and deeper into Russia, stretching his supply lines, exhausting his army until distance and deprivation did what Russian soldiers couldn't do in open battle: make Russia itself the weapon. The architect of this strategy was General Barclay de Tolly. He was Minister of War and commander of the First Western Army, and he was one of the most hated men in Russia. Barclay was ethnically Baltic German, not Russian. He spoke with an accent. He was cold, methodical, intellectual. Everything about him screamed foreign to Russian nobles and soldiers who believed in Russian courage and Orthodox faith. And now this foreign general was proposing that Russia not fight, that they run away, that they burn their own country and let Napoleon march to Moscow unopposed. It sounded like cowardice. It sounded like treason. General Pyotr Bagration, commander of the Second Western Army, hated the plan. Bagration was everything Barclay wasn't: ethnic Georgian, beloved by the troops, aggressive, emotional. He wanted to fight Napoleon at the border, defend Russian soil, win glory in battle like proper generals do. The Russian nobility hated the plan. Their estates were in Western Russia. The scorched earth strategy meant watching their lands be destroyed by their own army. Many officers hated the plan. It went against every military instinct. Retreat without fighting seemed dishonorable. But Tsar Alexander, reluctantly, supported Barclay. Because Alexander understood the mathematics. Russia couldn't win a direct fight. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The only chance was to avoid the direct fight altogether. So when Napoleon crossed the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, the Russian army began retreating. And almost immediately, the recriminations began. Russian officers were furious. Why aren't we fighting? Men who'd signed up to defend their country found themselves marching away from the enemy. Some thought Barclay was a French spy. Others thought he was simply a coward. Bagration wrote letters to anyone who would listen, denouncing Barclay. He called him a traitor. He demanded Alexander replace him. The two Russian armies, theoretically cooperating, were barely speaking to each other because the commanders despised each other. Meanwhile, Russian civilians watched in horror as their own army retreated through their villages and towns and set them on fire. Imagine being a farmer in Western Russia. You see the Russian army approaching, your army, coming to defend you, and instead they tell you to evacuate. Then they burn your house, your barn, your crops, everything, on purpose. Why are you doing this? The enemy isn't even here yet. We're denying supplies to the French for the good of Russia. It must have felt like betrayal, but it was working, sort of. Napoleon was advancing, but his army was already suffering. The roads were terrible. Supplies weren't keeping up. Horses were dying. Men were getting sick. And most importantly, Napoleon couldn't force the decisive battle he needed. The French kept trying to catch the Russian army, to pin them down and destroy them. The Russians kept slipping away. By late July, Napoleon had advanced 300 miles into Russia. His army had shrunk from 600,000 to about 400,000 without fighting a major battle. And he still hadn't accomplished anything. The strategy was working. But in Russia, it looked like disaster. Quick, like if you're finding this perspective interesting, it really helps the channel. Now back to the crisis facing Russia. Napoleon reached Smolensk in August. Finally, there was a battle. The Russians defended the city for 2 days, then retreated and burned it. Again. Another major Russian city in flames. Another retreat. The pressure on Barclay was becoming unbearable. Nobles were demanding his removal. Officers were openly insubordinate. Soldiers were demoralized. The Russian court was in chaos. Even Alexander was wavering. The political situation required a scapegoat. Someone had to take the blame for this humiliating retreat. That someone was Barclay de Tolly. In late August, Alexander replaced him. The new commander-in-chief was General Mikhail Kutuzov. Kutuzov was 67 years old. He was fat, he'd lost an eye in battle years earlier, and he was known more for political cunning than military genius. But he was ethnically Russian. He was Orthodox. He was popular with the troops. And everyone assumed he would finally turn and fight. Here's the irony. Kutuzov had no intention of fighting Napoleon any differently than Barclay had. He understood the same mathematics. Russia still couldn't win a direct battle. The strategy was still correct, but Kutuzov was politically savvy enough to make it look like he was doing something different. He announced that Russia would make a stand, defend Moscow, fight Napoleon to the death if necessary. The army and the public were thrilled. Finally, a real Russian general who would show proper courage. Kutuzov chose a defensive position at Borodino, about 75 miles west of Moscow. He built fortifications. He positioned his army. And on September 7, 1812, he fought the bloodiest single day of the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Borodino was carnage. 70,000 casualties in one day. The French attacked. The Russians defended. Artillery thundered for 12 hours. Men died in heaps. By nightfall, the French held the field. Technically, they'd won, but Kutuzov had accomplished exactly what he wanted. He'd given Russia a battle. The army had fought with courage. Honor was satisfied, and the French had been badly bloodied. Napoleon lost 30,000 men, including several generals. More importantly, the Russian army retreated in good order. They weren't destroyed. They could fight again. 2 days after Borodino, Kutuzov called a council of war. The question, should they defend Moscow or abandon it? Most of his generals wanted to defend the capital. Moscow was sacred, the heart of Russia. Abandoning it without a siege would be shameful. Kutuzov said no. His logic was simple. If they defended Moscow, they'd have to fight another battle like Borodino. They'd probably lose. The army would be destroyed. And then Napoleon would take Moscow anyway. Plus, he'd have no Russian army left to worry about. Better to abandon Moscow, save the army, and continue the strategy that was actually working. On September 14th, the Russian army marched out of Moscow. The population evacuated, and the city was left to Napoleon. But not before it was set on fire. The burning of Moscow is one of the most controversial events of the war. Who actually gave the order? Was it planned or spontaneous? Was it Kutuzov? Was it Tsar Alexander? Was it Governor Rostopchin acting on his own? We still don't know for sure. What we do know is that fires started breaking out almost immediately after Napoleon entered. Warehouses full of supplies, wooden neighborhoods, strategic buildings. Over 3 days, about 3/4 of Moscow burned. Rostopchin, the governor, definitely played a role. He'd evacuated firefighting equipment. He'd released prisoners from jails and possibly armed them to start fires. He'd later claim he acted on orders from Alexander, but Alexander would deny giving any such orders. Probably, it was a combination. Loose orders from above, aggressive interpretation by Rostopchin, some spontaneous fires from retreating Russians and incoming French troops, everything spiraling out of control in a city full of wooden buildings. Napoleon set up headquarters in the Kremlin, surrounded by a burning city, and waited for Alexander to negotiate peace. The negotiations never came. This was Kutuzov's plan coming together. Napoleon was stuck in Moscow with a devastated army in a burned city with winter approaching. He couldn't stay. There wasn't enough food or shelter. He couldn't advance further. His army was too weak. His only option was retreat. And when he retreated, Kutuzov would be waiting. While Napoleon sat in Moscow for 5 weeks hoping for peace, Kutuzov was rebuilding the Russian army. Reinforcements arrived from other parts of the empire. Supplies were gathered. And most importantly, Kutuzov positioned his army to control the roads south of Moscow. When Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat in late October, he wanted to take a southern route, through regions that hadn't been devastated. Fresh territory. Possible supplies. Kutuzov blocked that route. He forced Napoleon back onto the same road the French had used to advance. The road through burned cities and stripped countryside. The road where there was nothing to eat. And then Kutuzov did something brilliant. He didn't attack the main French army. That was still dangerous. Instead, he harassed them constantly. Cossack cavalry picked off stragglers. Partisan fighters ambushed supply. Wagons. Russian regular forces threatened from the flanks, forcing the French to stay bunched together and slow. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The French soldiers were starving. They were freezing as winter arrived. They were exhausted from months of marching. And every day, more men disappeared, fell behind, got separated, wandered off looking for food, and never came back. Kutuzov didn't need to destroy the French army. Russia was doing it for him. The partisan warfare deserves special attention because it was genuinely new. These weren't regular soldiers. They were peasants, former soldiers, Cossacks, anyone willing to fight. They operated in small groups. They knew the terrain. They hit supply convoys, stragglers, isolated units. The French called them bandits, but they were incredibly effective. They made it impossible for French foraging parties to find food. They created an atmosphere of constant danger. No French soldier was safe outside the main column. And here's what makes it remarkable. These partisans were fighting for the country that had just burned their homes. Russian peasants had watched their government destroy their villages, burn their crops, take their food. They had every reason to be angry at Russian leadership, but when it came to fighting the French, they fought fiercely. It suggests something about how Russians understood the stakes. This wasn't about loyalty to the Tsar or the nobility. This was about survival. Foreign invasion was worse than anything their own government could do. The climax came at the Borodino River in late November. Napoleon's army, now reduced to maybe 50,000 effective soldiers, needed to cross. The bridges were destroyed. Russian armies were closing in from multiple sides. French engineers built makeshift bridges while standing in freezing water. Many of them died from exposure while working. The army crossed under Russian artillery fire. Thousands drowned. Thousands more were left behind when the bridges collapsed. Kutuzov had a chance to completely annihilate Napoleon's army at the Berezina. He chose not to. He let them escape. Why? Probably political calculation. If he destroyed Napoleon completely, captured him, it might provoke France into years of revenge warfare. Better to let Napoleon limp home, defeated and humiliated, but alive. It was the same calculating pragmatism that had defined Russia's entire strategy. If you've stuck with me this far through Russia's perspective, consider subscribing. There's a new video every week, and your support makes this kind of deep research possible. Let's see how this all ended. By December, the remnants of Napoleon's army staggered back across the Niemen River into Poland. About 20,000 combat-ready soldiers out of 600,000. The greatest military disaster in European history. Russia had won, but at what cost? Russian military casualties were probably between 200 and 300,000. Enormous numbers, though less than French losses. But the civilian cost was worse and harder to calculate. Western Russia was devastated. Cities burned, farms destroyed, entire regions depopulated. The scorched earth strategy had worked militarily, but it left behind a wasteland. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of Russian civilians died from the war, either directly from violence or from starvation and disease in the aftermath. Villages that had been burned even by their own army took years to rebuild. The economic cost was staggering. The regions that had been richest, most productive, were now the poorest and most destroyed. And there was a social cost, too. The peasants who'd fought as partisans had tasted something like freedom and agency. They'd defended Russia. Some expected things to change afterward. They didn't. Serfdom continued exactly as before, but Russia had survived. And in the aftermath, something interesting happened. The disaster became a triumph. The humiliation became pride. The story of 1812 became Russia's foundational myth. Why? Because Russia had beaten Napoleon, not just survived, but actually defeated him. The unbeatable conqueror of Europe had been broken in Russia. The narrative that emerged went like this: Russian courage, Russian faith, Russian resilience had defeated foreign tyranny. General Winter and the vastness of Russia had been Russia's allies. The people, from nobles to peasants, had united to save the motherland. It was a powerful story. And like most powerful stories, it was partially true and partially mythology. The truth was messier. The victory came from controversial decisions made by unpopular generals. It came from sacrificing the western provinces. It came from political calculation more than noble courage. And it came with a price that Russia would be paying for decades. But the mythological version was what stuck. Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture, written 70 years later, captures the triumphant version. Cannon, fire, church bells, Russian themes conquering the French Marseillaise. Glorious victory. Tolstoy's War and Peace, written 50 years after the events, presents a more complex version, but still fundamentally patriotic. Kutuzov as the wise old general who understood that sometimes not fighting is the real victory. The Soviet Union would embrace 1812 as proof that Russia could defeat any invader through sacrifice and resilience. When Hitler invaded in 1941, Soviet propaganda explicitly invoked 1812, same strategy, retreat, trade space for time, let winter and distance destroy the invader. It worked again. The Soviets even called it the Great Patriotic War, echoing the language used for 1812. So, in a strange way, Barclay de Tolly's controversial strategy became the template for Russian defensive warfare for 2 centuries. Don't fight on the enemy's terms. Make them fight on yours. Make the country itself the weapon. Accept terrible losses if necessary. It's a strategy that only works if you have vast space, harsh climate, and a population willing to endure almost anything. Russia had all 3 in 1812, and somehow, through controversial leadership, desperate measures, and enormous sacrifice, they found a way to win. The final irony is this: the general who actually developed the winning strategy, Barclay de Tolly, was never fully rehabilitated in Russian memory. He was too foreign, too cold, too unpopular. Kutuzov got the glory, even though he mostly continued Barclay's plan. Rostopchin, who possibly burned Moscow against orders, spent the rest of his life alternately taking credit and denying responsibility depending on who was asking. And Alexander, who'd made the ultimate decision to fight rather than submit to Napoleon's demands, went on to lead Russian armies into France in 1813 and 1814. He was present at Napoleon's abdication. Russia went from desperate defense to conquering Paris in 2 years. But it all came back to those terrible decisions in 1812. Retreat, when everyone wanted to fight. Burn cities to save the country. Sacrifice the West to save the whole. Let the enemy advance until advancing became his defeat. These weren't obvious choices. They weren't popular choices. They were gambles that could easily have failed. If Napoleon had brought better supplies, if he'd stopped at Smolensk, if winter had come later, if any of a dozen things had gone differently, Barclay and Kutuzov would be remembered as the generals who let Napoleon conquer Russia without a real fight. But they won. The gambit worked. Russia survived by nearly destroying itself. And that's the story we don't usually hear. Not Napoleon's mistakes, but Russia's terrible, brilliant, desperate choices. And that's the story of Russia's greatest gamble. Thanks for watching all the way through. This one took a lot of research to get the Russian perspective right, and I hope it gave you a new angle on a story you might have already known. If you enjoyed this different take, the channel has a new video every week exploring historical events from unexpected angles. Hit subscribe if you want more of this. Leave a comment. Did you know about the controversy around Russia's strategy? What other historical events do you want to see from the other side? There's always another perspective worth exploring. Until next time.